Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Kings, in which the Sharks lost 4-2. Now, 4-game losing streak, all 4 of those games in regulation, and this being maybe the worst loss, at least on paper, due to the fact that they lost to the bottom team in the Western Conference, I believe even the 30th place team in the entire National Hockey League. And the first period did not start off very well for the Sharks. They gave up the first goal to Dustin Brown, and in the first 15 or so minutes of it, the Kings were the much better team, the Sharks getting basically nothing generated. Now, luckily for them, in the last 5 or so minutes, they got a few shots off and they managed to get a goal from Barclay Goodrow, and they were pretty lucky to be tied 1-1 at the end of the first period. The Sharks did wake up going into the second. They scored the only goal in that frame from Tomas Hertl, his 32nd, and so it seemed like the Sharks were on their way to another one of their classic third period closeouts where they take a lead into the third period, they protect it well, and they win the game. But about halfway or so through the third period, it was a first career goal, something we haven't seen in a few games here for the Sharks, but they give one up now. First career goal for the Kings defenseman Roy, as he ties the game, and just a couple minutes later, it's Andrei Kopitar who manages to give the Kings the lead. 2 unanswered goals in the third period. Eventually, Jeff Carter would add to that with an empty net, and the Sharks would drop this one in regulation. Only the second time this season they've lost a game in regulation with a lead going into the third period. The previous time, a game in about mid-October, which was like the 6th game of the season for the Sharks, to the New Jersey Devils. So we have not seen the Sharks have a third period collapse in regulation since the start of the season, and we all know how different the start of the season Sharks were to the end of the season Sharks where they are now. This loss also leaves the Sharks with 94 points. Meanwhile, the Calgary Flames were victorious tonight over the Ottawa Senators. This moved them up to 99 points, so the Sharks 5 points behind. Going to be pretty difficult to catch them now. The Sharks do have a matchup with the Flames again this season, so technically winning that one puts them to within 3 points, which is possible still. But with the Flames having such an easy schedule, it's definitely going to be quite tough to catch them, and so it seems as though it's quite likely the Sharks will face off against the Golden Knights in the first round. Definitely a nightmare scenario for most San Jose Sharks fans. And it's also important to watch out for the fact that with the Golden Knights having won tonight, 5-0 against the Winnipeg Jets, having won 10 of their last 11 games since acquiring Mark Stone, with the only loss being against the aforementioned Calgary Flames, the Golden Knights only find themselves 5 points behind the Sharks, again with a matchup against the Sharks left this season. So the Golden Knights win that one, they're only 3 points behind the San Jose Sharks. So the Sharks have to be very careful that they can hold this home ice advantage in that first round, because the Golden Knights are already going to be a handful for the Sharks to be able to handle. If they give up home ice and they have to play more games at T-Mobile Arena, we all know how good the Golden Knights are at home. It's going to be very difficult for the San Jose Sharks, so they have to be careful here. Even if they still can't catch Calgary, there's going to be some very key victories down the stretch. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who had a very weird game, honestly enough. Definitely difficult to get a bit of a read on it because, I mean, you take a look at, if you were to watch the highlights and you take a look at the goals that were scored by the Kings, Kopitar's he had no chance on. But Brown, yeah, maybe it was a bit screened, but Jones probably could have had it. Roy's definitely could have had it, because even if it was a bit of like a floating knuckler puck, it doesn't look like it was deflected at all. So it looks like a pretty bad game just from a highlight standpoint for Martin Jones, letting in 2 pretty soft goals. But he also made some very key saves. I mean, just take a look in the first period. A couple of very good ones on Grundstrom, a good one on Doughty, I believe, late in the first period. And so even if you take away that Dustin Brown goal and say, oh, that was a soft one, you know, an average goaltender wouldn't let that one in. An average goaltender probably would have let in a couple of the other ones, and so it probably would have still been something like 2-1 Los Angeles by the end of the first period. And so what Jones, you know, I guess did in terms of giving up soft goals, he also made up for that fact by actually, you know, making some key saves. And so an average goaltender, you know, like a robot goaltender who makes saves on all the low scoring chances but lets in a lot of the high danger ones, is probably going to let in just about 3 goals as well this game. And so I wouldn't say this one is on Jones as much as it's on a pretty poor performance from the majority of the Sharks roster in this one. It was just not that great of a game for them. But it's hard to blame them in that fact, which brings me to my next point, because of the fact that the Sharks were dealing with so many injuries. I mean, already Karlsson was out, already Pavelski was out since last game, and already Shemek was out, and Logan Couture joined them on the sidelines as he was pretty late right before the game type of scratch with flu-like symptoms. And so I've seen a lot of sentiment about the fact that, there's no excuses. The Sharks should never lose to a game to the team at the bottom of the Western Conference, even with all the injuries. And, I understand the whole no excuses thing when it comes to things like a back-to-back game or an afternoon game or a lot of travel, because those are things that definitely have an effect, but you should be able to, I guess, work through them. Injuries, I don't really feel the same about, and I really think injuries are an actual good excuse. I mean, you take away, this team's top defender, or at least one of their two top defenders, you take away their top centerman, you take away one of their top wingers, and you take away a strong depth defenseman. They're not as good as a second place team in the Western Conference should be without those four players. I mean, you take a look, if you were to take the 74 games that they have played so far this season, and you were to go from game 1 to 74, you ran through them all again, and you took out Karlsson, you took out Shemek, you took out Couture, and you took out Joe Pavelski from those games, the record after those 74 games would probably put them in a similar position to the Los Angeles Kings. So the only thing on paper that showed that the Sharks were a better team than the Kings coming into this one was their record, because it definitely wasn't the rosters that were dressed tonight. Yeah, you could argue the Sharks, even without those four players, still have a better roster than the Kings, but it's very, very close. So I wouldn't say that the Sharks definitely should have won, and it's a huge disappointment that they didn't, because they were just dealing with so much. I mean, all of these players play some pretty significant minutes. Erik Karlsson's like a 25-minute guy at times. Couture and Pavelski can easily hover around 20 minutes. Shemek gets the lowest here, but still with about like 17 or 18 minutes a game. So these aren't just some sort of depth forwards. These are key guys. You take a look at a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning. If you were to take away, Hedman, Kucherov, Steven Stamkos, and Anton Stralman, the best team maybe of all time at this point would maybe even not be a playoff team in a situation like that. That's how big these injuries are. So I don't view them as much of it like as a an excuse that shouldn't matter as much of it is like an excuse that definitely should matter. So while the Sharks, I would have liked to see them win this game, and it was definitely still possible for them to win this game, I think without the context of feeling bad that they lost 3 games in a row and then lost this one, it's not the worst loss in the world, and it's not completely unexpected and disappointing. I will talk about these special teams, though, because while I don't want to necessarily mention some of the players who played poorly in this one, because as I said, it was pretty difficult circumstances for the Sharks, I will mention the special teams because it sort of transcends the injuries here. In this game, the Sharks did go 0 for 2 on the power play, and it still didn't look good. But the power play struggles predate the Logan Couture injury, and it predates even the Joe Pavelski injury. It's been mostly, not since Erik Karlsson went down, but pretty recently since that point. And the power play has been struggling. I don't worry about it too much. The team was still 6th place in the league coming into tonight. And I think once Couture and Pavelski, and especially Erik Karlsson, do return, it should pick up the pace. What I would be more worried about is the penalty kill, because I feel like it hasn't just been a few games the penalty kill has been struggling. I feel like it's been, a good few weeks even, or maybe even more than that. And I don't think the returns from injury, Couture is going to help it, but it isn't just limited to this game. I don't think the return of Erik Karlsson is going to suddenly rocket this team back up to, let's say, 2nd place, which they were at some point earlier on in the season. And with, as I've said multiple times, the fact that penalty kills and power plays are so important come playoff time because of the fact that there are a lot less penalties called in the playoffs, you can't really afford to have struggling penalty kills and power plays like the Sharks currently do have. So I think the power play should rebound, but I think what the major focus here working on for the Sharks should be that penalty kill, because they're letting through a lot more passes than they were earlier on in the season. And I think the most important part is that they're not being able to clear the front of the net. A lot of the times they're allowing players to either screen Martin Jones or, even worse, tip pucks past Martin Jones. And it's something that the Sharks were doing somewhat better earlier on in the season, and it seems to have lost that part of their game in the past few weeks. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow against the Anaheim Ducks. We'll see if Logan Couture does return from these flu-like symptoms. He's only going to have the 24 hours to recover, so it's possible he isn't there for tomorrow's game, which will make it a similarly tough one like this one. The Ducks are still at the bottom of the standings, like the Los Angeles Kings. I believe they're the only team ahead, or the Kings are the only team behind the Ducks in the Western Conference, so this isn't going to be an extremely difficult game. It's definitely a bit lucky for the Sharks that they're dealing with so many injuries playing against the two worst teams in a row, but as we saw here tonight, when you're dealing with this many injuries, there's no free games, and they lost to the Kings here. They're going to have to put up a very good performance if they don't want to lose to the Ducks as well. Class dismissed.